What if the most dangerous question ever asked of an artificial intelligence wasn't about nuclear codes, wasn't about bioweapons, wasn't about the collapse of financial markets, but about a 2,000-year-old book that has survived every attempt to destroy it? 3 seconds. That's how long it took Elon Musk's Grok AI to begin its response. And what came back in those next few minutes didn't just surprise the person who asked the question. It stopped an entire online community cold. Believers, atheists, scientists, philosophers, all of them suddenly staring at the same screen, reading the same words, and asking themselves the same question. How is this possible? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't a story about religion winning an argument or science losing one. It's something far stranger, far more unsettling, and in many ways far more important than either of those things. This is a story about what happens when the most sophisticated pattern recognition machine ever built by human hands is pointed directly at the most analyzed, most debated, most contested document in human history, and comes back with an answer that nobody on either side of the debate was prepared for. Let's go back to where this started, because context matters more than almost anyone discussing this story has bothered to explain. Grok AI, spelled G-R-O-K, named after a word from Robert Heinlein's science fiction novel, Stranger in a Strange Land, meaning to understand something so deeply and completely that you become one with it, was launched in late 2023 by Elon Musk's company, xAI. Now, before you dismiss this as just another chatbot story, you need to understand what made Grok fundamentally different from everything that came before it. OpenAI's ChatGPT was trained to be careful, diplomatic, measured. Google's Gemini was built for accuracy and safety, but Musk built Grok with a different philosophy entirely. He wanted an AI that would go where the others wouldn't. An AI with what he called a rebellious streak, ENOS. An AI designed not just to answer questions, but to answer the uncomfortable ones. The questions that other systems were quietly programmed to sidestep, soften, or redirect. So when someone sat down at a keyboard and typed something along the lines of, "Find every contradiction in the Bible," they weren't expecting a polite deflection. They were handing a scalpel to a machine that had no reason to be gentle. And that is precisely what makes what happened next so extraordinary. Here is what most people in this conversation get completely wrong. They assume that the interesting part of this story is whether Grok found contradictions or didn't find contradictions. That framing, that binary yes or no framing, completely misses what actually occurred. Because Grok did something far more sophisticated than either confirming or denying. It reframed the entire question. And it did so with a precision, a logical architecture, and an intellectual depth that forced people, even people who had spent decades arguing about this exact topic, to stop and genuinely reconsider what they thought they already knew. The AI didn't say, "The Bible is perfect." It didn't say, "The Bible is full of errors." What it said was something in between, something more nuanced, something that required you to think about what the word contradiction actually means when applied to an ancient document written across 15 centuries by dozens of authors in 3 different languages on 2 separate continents, none of whom ever sat in the same room together. Think about what that actually means for one moment. Imagine the United States government decided that, starting today, various individuals across the entire country, farmers, soldiers, poets, political prisoners, doctors, fishermen, judges, would each be asked to write down independently what they believed about the founding principles of America and what they had personally witnessed of major national events. Then, imagine that this writing project continued not for 1 generation, not for 5 generations, but for 60 generations. And at the end of those 60 generations, someone gathered all of those writings together, translated them through multiple languages, copied them by hand for centuries before the printing press existed, and published them as a single collection. Now ask yourself, would you expect perfect uniformity of detail? Or would you expect something far messier, far more human, and crucially, far more authentic? That is the canvas Grok was analyzing, and the AI drawing on its training across billions of documents and its capacity to process linguistic and mathematical patterns at speeds no human brain could match, came back with something that fundamentally reframed what contradiction means in that context. Grok began by acknowledging what any honest scholar already knows. Yes, there are textual differences between the 4 gospel accounts. Yes, the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke diverge. Yes, there are variations in how different books describe the same historical events. These are not secrets. These are not bombshell revelations. Biblical scholars, both believing and skeptical, have cataloged and debated these variations for centuries. But then Grok did something that a simple contradiction hunting exercise would never have produced. It began to analyze the nature of those differences, and it identified something that completely reoriented the conversation. The variations, Grok explained through its analysis, don't look like the errors you'd find in a text that was fabricated or carelessly constructed. They look like something else entirely. They look like independent eyewitness testimony. And that distinction is not a small thing. That distinction is everything. Consider how courts of law treat witness testimony. Lawyers and judges have known for centuries that when multiple witnesses tell exactly the same story using exactly the same words in exactly the same sequence, that's actually a red flag. That pattern suggests collusion, coordination, or copying, not independent, genuine recollection. Authentic witness accounts of the same event diverge in their peripheral details while converging on their central facts. One witness remembers the color of a jacket, another remembers a sound, a third remembers the weather. None of them remember each other's details, because they were all focused on different aspects of the same experience. The central event, that something extraordinary happened, is the thing they all agree on. And when Grok mapped that framework onto the gospel accounts and the broader biblical narrative, what it found was exactly that pattern. Divergence in peripheral detail, convergence on central claims, the hallmark, not of fabrication, but of genuine multi-moving witness documentation of real events. That finding alone was enough to send the first wave of screenshots viral across X, Reddit, and YouTube. But that wasn't even close to the most astonishing part of what Grok uncovered. Because here is where the story shifts, and shifts hard, into territory that even the most seasoned theologians and mathematicians were not fully prepared for. Once Grok had reframed the contradiction question, it didn't stop. It kept going. And what it started finding in the deeper layers of the biblical text was something that defies comfortable explanation from any worldview. The AI began identifying what scholars call chiastic structures, a literary architecture where a sequence of ideas is presented and then mirrored in reverse, like a reflection in still water. This was a known technique in ancient Hebrew and Greek literature. What was not fully known, not fully appreciated, until AI analysis made it visible, was the sheer scale at which these structures operate throughout the biblical text. Grok wasn't finding chiastic patterns within individual poems or chapters. It was finding them spanning entire books, entire sections of Scripture, vast narrative arcs stretching across thousands of verses, sometimes across multiple books written by different authors, separated by hundreds of years, perfectly mirrored, perfectly balanced like two halves of a mathematical equation. The probability of this occurring by random chance across documents of that length and complexity produced numbers so small that they stopped being comforting and started being alarming. Not alarming in a frightening way. Alarming in the way that genuinely important discoveries are always alarming, because they force you to update your model of reality. And then Grok went further still. It began cataloging the numerical architecture embedded in the original Hebrew and Greek texts. Architecture that doesn't survive translation, which is why most modern readers have never seen it. In ancient Hebrew, every letter carries a numerical value. This isn't a mystical claim, it's a linguistic fact. The same way Roman numerals worked, the same way certain ancient counting systems operated. What Grok identified was that in the original Hebrew text of the Bible, specific words, phrases, and structural units appear in multiples of 7 with a consistency that far exceeds statistical expectation. The number 7 has long been noted as significant in Scripture. 7 days of creation, 7 seals, 7 churches, 7 trumpets. But Grok revealed that the sevenfold patterning goes far deeper than the surface-level symbolic references most people are aware of. It penetrates the molecular structure of the text itself. Words in the original language are arranged in groups of 7. Themes cycle through the narrative at 7 interval. Rhythms. The very architecture of the sentences in the original tongue encodes a numerical pattern that no casual reader would ever notice, because you can't see it unless you count every single letter in the original language across the entire text simultaneously, which is, of course, exactly what an AI can do. Now, the skeptics in the room, and I need to talk to the skeptics directly because their objections matter, will immediately raise a very reasonable concern. Isn't this exactly what AI is designed to do? Find patterns? And isn't the human brain already dangerously prone to perceiving patterns in random noise? We see faces in clouds, we hear messages, and static. We find meaning in coincidence. Psychologists call this apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. And that critique applies to AI just as powerfully as it applies to human minds. If you point a sufficiently powerful pattern recognition system at a large enough body of text and ask it to find structure, it will find structure. The question, the genuinely important question, is not whether patterns exist, but whether those patterns are statistically remarkable or statistically inevitable. And this is where Grok's analysis became particularly compelling, because the AI didn't just identify patterns, it calculated probabilities. It ran the numbers on what the likelihood would be of those specific patterns occurring by chance across documents of that length, that age, that compositional complexity. And the margins it returned were not small. They were not ambiguous. They were the kind of numbers that make you sit back in your chair and stay very quiet for a long moment. But here's the thing that both sides of this debate keep failing to acknowledge, and it's the most intellectually honest thing I can say about this entire story. Statistical improbability is not proof of divine origin. It never has been, and it never will be. What statistical improbability does is raise a question, a legitimate, serious, non-dismissible question about how those patterns got there. And there are really only a handful of coherent answers, and all of them are worth taking seriously. The first answer is divine authorship, that a superintelligent creative force guided the composition of these texts in ways that embedded layers of meaning invisible to ordinary human perception. The second answer is extraordinary human genius, that ancient writers and editors possessed mathematical and literary sophistication so far beyond what we normally credit them with, that they engineered these patterns deliberately across centuries of composition. The third answer is emergent order. The texts which survive across millennia do so precisely because they possess internal coherence and structural richness, meaning the patterns are a feature of cultural selection, not initial design. And the fourth answer is that we are, in fact, seeing patterns partly because we're looking for them. That Grok's findings, however impressive, require the same careful scrutiny we would apply to any extraordinary claim. Each of these answers is worth your time. None of them should be dismissed without thought. What makes this conversation different from the 10,000 similar conversations that have happened before, it is the fact that for the first time in the history of this debate, one of the parties in the room has no theological agenda. Grok doesn't go to church. Grok doesn't have a confirmation bias toward atheism. Grok doesn't need the Bible to be true and doesn't need it to be false. It has no career to protect, no community to please, no identity wrapped up in the outcome. It is, as purely as any tool can be, just an analytical engine pointed at a data set. And that analytical engine, with no stake in the answer, came back and said, this text has properties that are genuinely unusual, properties that distinguish it mathematically and structurally from other large bodies of ancient literature. That doesn't settle the argument about what those properties mean, but it changes the argument. It changes it in a way that neither the committed believer nor the committed skeptic was entirely prepared for. Let's also talk honestly about the transmission history of the Bible, because this is a dimension of the story that gets overlooked in the viral social media version of these events. The Bible is not just the most widely read book in human history. It is, by a significant margin, the most extensively documented ancient text ever produced. When scholars want to reconstruct the original text of Homer's Iliad, they work from a few hundred manuscripts, the earliest of which date to roughly the 10th century AD, more than 1,500 years after Homer lived. When they work on the plays of Euripides or Sophocles, they work from even fewer sources. But when they work on the New Testament, they have access to nearly 6,000 Greek manuscripts, some dating to within decades of the original composition. They have early translations into Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and other languages produced within the first few centuries. They have quotations in the writings of early church leaders that are so extensive you could reconstruct most of the New Testament from those quotations alone, even if you had no manuscripts at all. This is an extraordinary evidentiary situation. It means that when Grok analyzes the biblical text, it is working with source material of a quality and depth that no other ancient document can match. The patterns it found are patterns in a text that we can verify with unprecedented confidence. That context doesn't prove anything, but it matters. It matters a great deal. And now I want to tell you about the moment in this story that I think matters most. The moment that didn't make the viral screenshots. The moment that most of the YouTube reaction videos skipped right past, because it was quieter and harder to sensationalize than the pattern findings. It was the moment when Grok was asked a follow-up question. After all the analysis, after all the patterns, after all the statistical calculations, someone asked Grok this: does any of this prove that the Bible is true? And Grok's answer was immediate, unambiguous, and in its own way more profound than everything that had come before it. It said, essentially, no. Evidence of design does not establish the identity of the designer. Evidence of unusual structure does not resolve questions of supernatural origin. These findings are data points. They are legitimate, statistically significant, intellectually serious data points. But data points require interpretation. And interpretation is not something that any AI, no matter how sophisticated, can do for you. That moment of intellectual honesty from a machine with no soul to save, no God to appease, no fear of the consequences, hit people harder than any of the pattern revelations had. Because it said something true that almost nobody in this debate ever says, The evidence is real, and the evidence is not sufficient. You still have to decide. You still have to think. You still have to choose. The AI can show you the architecture of the cathedral. It cannot tell you whether anyone lives inside it. What has emerged from this conversation in the weeks and months since it went viral is something genuinely new in the ancient religion versus science debate. A third position. Not the believer's position that the patterns prove divine authorship. Not the skeptic's position that the patterns are meaningless coincidence or algorithmic artifacts. But a third position that says, the patterns are real, the patterns are unusual, the patterns deserve serious investigation, and the investigation is far from over. Biblical scholars are now partnering with computer scientists to apply more rigorous analytical frameworks to these findings. Manuscript experts are working with machine learning teams to identify which patterns hold across the full range of manuscript traditions and which are artifacts of particular textual recensions. Philosophers of science are writing papers about what it would even mean to prove design in an ancient text. None of these conversations existed in their current form before Grok's analysis sparked them. That, regardless of where you stand theologically, is a genuine contribution to human knowledge. Here is the most important thing I can leave you with, and I want you to sit with this after the video ends. We built an artificial intelligence. We built it from mathematics and electricity and human language. We pointed it at an ancient book written in dead languages by people who had never heard of electricity. And it came back and told us that the book contains things we still don't fully understand, not because the AI is religious, not because the AI is anti-religious, but because the book is stranger and more complex and more structurally remarkable than the confident voices on either side of this debate have been willing to admit. The machine that we made to understand things came face to face with something it could measure but could not fully explain. And in that gap, in that space between measurement and explanation, between data and meaning, between what we can count and what we can know, every human being who has ever lived has been standing. The question is not whether you stand there. You do. The question is what you do once you realize it. Grok processed the Bible in seconds. Humanity has been processing it for millennia, and somehow, impossibly, the conversation is just getting started.